When people hear about conflicts in the Middle East, many people think these are regional political problems that mainly affect the countries involved. However, in today's globalized world, the consequences of these conflicts expand far beyond the region. Today, I will explain how geopolitical instability in the Middle East affects global oil prices and why resolving these conflicts is essential for protecting global economic stability. First, we need to understand why oil remains so important in the modern world. Although many countries are investing in renewable energies such as solar, wind, and hydrogen, the reality is that the global economy still heavily depends on petroleum. Oil is not only used for cars, instead it is the foundation of global transportation and industrial production. It provides fuel for cargo ships, airplanes, trucks, and trains that move goods around the world. Furthermore, oil is also an important material for producing plastics, fertilizers, and many chemical products. Because of this dependence, when oil prices increase, the effect spreads throughout the entire economy. For ordinary people, this is not just a number shown on financial news. Rather, it directly affects daily life. For example, higher oil prices increase gasoline price, transportation cost, and electricity cost. More importantly, they create food inflation because modern agriculture depends heavily on fuel. Farmers use diesel machines, and food companies rely on transportation networks to move products from farms to consumers. Therefore, when fuel becomes more expensive, the cost of producing and delivering food increases. As a result, basic goods such as bread, milk, and vegetables become more expensive. This impact is especially serious for lower income populations because they spend a larger portion of their income on essential goods.
Not working? You just make a presentation, okay? Just continue.
However, the relationship between Middle Eastern conflicts and oil prices is more complicated than simple supply and demand. Traditional economic theory explains that prices rise when demand increases or supply decreases. Although this explanation is correct, it does not fully explain the modern oil market because oil is strongly connected to political risks. This is where the concept of the geopolitical risk premium becomes important. The geopolitical risk premium means that oil prices include an additional cost based on the possibility of future disruptions. For example, when a conflict occurs near an important oil producing area or a major shipping route, investors become worried that future oil supplies may be interrupted. Even before an actual shortage happens, traders begin buying oil futures contracts to protect themselves. Therefore, oil prices rise because markets react not only to current situation but also to future expectations. Furthermore, high oil prices create another major economic problem: cost-push inflation. Because oil is an important input for almost every industry, higher energy costs increase production costs. Factories need more money for transportation, electricity, and materials. As a result, companies increase the prices of their products to cover these additional costs. This creates inflation across the economy. At the same time, economic growth can slow because consumers have less money to spend. Therefore, the combination of inflation and slow economic growth creates stagflation, which is one of the most difficult economic situations for governments to manage. In addition to this economic mechanism, we also need to consider the geographical vulnerability of global energy systems. One of the most important examples is the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most critical energy checkpoints because it connects the Persian Gulf with global markets. Every day, around 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products pass through this narrow waterway. However, because this area is geopolitically limited and politically unstable, any military conflict can immediately create uncertainty in global energy market. Therefore, even the possibility of a blockade can increase oil prices because markets fear future supply disruptions. Similarly, the Red Sea crisis shows that Middle Eastern conflicts affect not only oil but also global trade. The Red Sea is an essential route connecting Asia and Europe through the Suez Canal. However, attacks on commercial ships forced by many companies to avoid this region and take a longer route around Africa. As a result, ships require more time and fuel, shipping costs increase, and global supply chains become less efficient. Therefore, regional conflicts in the Middle East can disrupt international trade or beyond the conflict zone. However, some people argue that oil prices are mainly influenced by traditional economic factors such as global demand growth or decision by oil-producing countries like OPEC+. They argue that Middle Eastern conflicts are only temporary influences. Nevertheless, historical evidence shows that this argument is incomplete. A clear example is the Libyan civil war. During the conflict, attacks on oil facilities caused Libya's oil productions to collapse, removing more than 1 million barrels of oil per day from the global market. This happened even though global demand had not suddenly changed. Therefore, this proves that political conflicts can directly affect global energy market. Furthermore, history provides additional examples. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War led to an oil embargo, causing oil prices to increase dramatically. Then, in 1979, the Iranian Revolution disrupted oil production and created another major global energy crisis. These events caused inflation, fuel shortage, and economic recessions. Therefore, Middle Eastern instability is not a new problem. It is a repeated structural risk for the global economy. Finally, the impact of oil shocks is different depending on the country. For example, countries like South Korea and Japan are highly vulnerable because they depend heavily on imported energy. When oil prices rise, manufacturing costs increase, making their exports more expensive. Meanwhile, developing countries often suffer even more. Because they have fewer financial resources, higher energy prices can cause fuel shortage, electricity problems, and higher food prices. Therefore, the consequences of Middle Eastern conflicts are not equally distributed, and vulnerable populations often experience the greatest damage. In conclusion, global oil instability is not only an economic issue. Instead, it is deeply connected to international politics, security, diplomacy. The evidence shows that Middle Eastern conflicts influence oil prices through the geopolitical risk premium, disrupt important shipping routes, increase inflation, and show global economic growth. Therefore, traditional economic policies alone cannot completely solve this problem because they cannot remove the source of instability. For this reason, long-term diplomatic solutions are necessary. The international community must focus on cooperation and conflict resolution rather than rely only on military actions. Protecting peace in the Middle East is not only a regional goal, it is an economic necessity. Thank you for listening.
Any questions? No? No question?
Well done.